is the Enchanted Snake. There was once upon a time a poor woman who would have given all she possessed for a child, but she hadn't one. Now it happened one day that her husband went to the wood to collect brushwood, and when he had brought it home he discovered a pretty little snake among the twigs. When Sabatella, for that was the name of the peasant's wife, saw the little beast, she sighed deeply and sighed, "Even the snakes have their brood. I am unfortunate and have no children." No sooner had she said these words than, to her intense surprise, the little snake looked up at her face and spoke. "Since you have no children, be a mother to me instead, and I will promise you will never repent it, for I will love you as if I was your own son." At first, Sabatella was frightened to death at hearing a snake speak. But, plucking up her courage, she replied, "If it weren't for any other reason than your kindly thought, I would agree to what you say, and I will love you and look after you like a mother." So she gave the snake a little hole in the front of the house for its bed, and fed it with all the nicest food she could think of, and seemed as if she never could show it enough kindness. Day by day it grew bigger and fatter, and at last one morning it said to Cola Matteo, the peasant, whom it had always regarded as his father, "Dear Papa, I am now of a suitable age, and wish to marry." "I'm quite agreeable," answered Matteo, "and I'll do my best to find another snake like yourself and arrange a match between you." "Why, if you do that," replied the snake, "we shall be no better than the vipers and reptiles, and that's not at all what I want. No, I'd much prefer to marry the king's daughter. Therefore I pray you to go without further delay and demand an audience with the king, and tell him a snake wishes to marry his daughter." Cola Matteo, who was rather a simpleton, went as he desired to the king, and having obtained an audience, he said, "Your Majesty, I have often heard that people lose nothing by asking, so I have come to inform you that a snake wants to marry your daughter, and I'd be glad to know if you're willing to mate a dove with a serpent." The king, who saw at once that the man was a fool, said, in order to get quit of him, "Go home and tell your friend the snake that if he can turn this palace into ivory, inlaid with gold and silver, before tomorrow at noon, I will let him marry my daughter." And with a hearty laugh, he dismissed the peasant. When Cola Matteo brought his answer back to the snake, the little creature didn't seem the least bit put out, but said, "Tomorrow morning before sunrise you must go to the wood and gather a bunch of green herbs, and then rub the threshold of the palace with them, and you'll see what will happen." Cola Matteo, who was, as I've said before, a great simpleton, made no reply. But before sunrise next morning he went to the wood, and got a bunch of St. John's wort and rosemary and such like herbs, and rubbed them as he had been told on the floor of the palace. Hardly had he done so when the walls immediately turned into ivory, so richly inlaid with gold and silver that they dazzled the eyes of all the beholders. The king, when he rose and saw the miracle that had been performed, was beside himself with amazement, and frankly didn't know what in the world he was to do. But when Colomateo came next day, and in the name of the snake demanded the hand of the princess, the king replied, "Don't be in such a hurry. If the snake really wants to marry my daughter, he must do some more things first. First, one of these is to turn all the paths and walls of my garden into pure gold, before tomorrow noon." When the snake was told of this new condition, he replied, "Tomorrow morning, early, you must go and collect all the odds and ends of rubbish you can in the streets, and then take them and throw them on the paths and walls of the garden, and you'll see then if we won't know more than a match for the old king." So Cola Mateo rose at cockcrow, took a large basket under his arm, and carefully collected all the broken fragments of pots and pans, and jugs and lamps, and other trash of that sort. No sooner had he scattered them over the paths and walls of the king's garden than they became one blaze of glittering gold, so that everyone's eyes were dazzled with the brilliancy, and everyone's soul was filled with wonder. The king, too, was amazed at the sight, but still he couldn't make up his mind to part with his daughter. So when Cola Mateo came to remind him of his promise, he replied, "I have still a third demand to make. If the snake can turn all the trees and fruit in my garden into precious stones, then I promise him my daughter in marriage." When the peasant informed the snake what the king had replied, "Tomorrow morning, early, you must go to the market and buy all the fruit you see there, and sow all the stones and seeds in the palace garden, and, if I'm not mistaken, the king will be satisfied with the result." Colomateo rose at dawn, and taking a basket on his arm, he went to the market and bought all the pomegranates, apricots, cherries, and other fruit he could find there, and sowed the seeds and stones in the palace garden. In one moment the trees were ablaze with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and every other precious stone you can think of. This time the king felt obligated to keep his promise, and calling his daughter to him, he said, "My dear Grenoina," for that was the princess's name, "more as a joke than anything else, I demanded what seemed to be impossibilities from your bridegroom. But now that he has done all I required, I am bound to stick to my part of the bargain. So be a good child, and as you love me, do not force me to break my word, but give yourself up with as good grace as you can, and in most unhappy fate." "Do with me what you like, my lord and father. Your will is my law," answered Grenoia. When the king heard this, he told Cola Mateo to bring the snake to the palace, and said that he was prepared to receive the creature as his son-in-law. The snake arrived at court in a carriage made of gold and drawn by 6 white elephants. But whatever it appeared on the way, the people fled in terror at the sight of the frightful reptile. When the snake reached the palace, all the courtiers shook and trembled with fear down to the very scullion, and the king and queen were in such a state of nervous collapse that they hid themselves in a faraway turret. Grenonia alone kept her presence of mind, and although her father and mother implored her to fly for her life, she wouldn't move a step, saying, "I'm certainly not going to fly from the man you have chosen for my husband." As soon as the snake saw Grenonia, it wound its tail around her and kissed her. Then, leading her into a room, it shut the door, and throwing off its skin, it changed into a beautiful young man with golden locks and flashing eyes, who embraced Grenonia tenderly and said all sorts of pretty things to her. When the king saw the snake shut itself into a room with his daughter, he said to his wife, Heaven be merciful to our child, for I fear it is all over for her now. This cursed snake will most likely have swallowed her up." Then they put their eyes to the keyhole to see what was happening. Their amazement knew no bounds when they saw the beautiful youth standing before their daughter with the snake skin lying on the floor beside him. In their excitement, they burst open the door, and seizing the skin, they threw it into the fire. But no sooner had they done this than the young man called out, "Oh, wretched people, what have you done?" And before they had time to look around, he had changed himself into a dove, and dashing against the window, he broke a pane of glass and flew away from sight. But Grannonia, who in one and the same moment saw herself merry and sad, cheerful and despairing, rich and beggared, complained bitterly over this robbery of her happiness, this poisoning of her cup of joy, this unlucky stroke of fortune, this other sign of bad luck, and laid all the blame on her parents, though they assured her that they had meant her no harm. But the princess refused to be comforted, and at night, when all inhabitants of the palace were asleep, she stole out a back door, disguised as a peasant woman, determined to seek for her lost happiness until she found it. When she got to the outskirts of town, led by the light of the moon, she met a fox who offered to accompany her, an offer which Grannonia gladly accepted, saying, "You are most heartily welcome, for I don't know my way at all around the neighborhood." So they went on their way together, and at last came to a wood, where, being tired with walking, they passed to rest under the shade of a tree, where a spring of waters sported in the tender grass, refreshing it with its crystal-clear spray. They laid themselves down on the green carpet, and soon fell fast asleep, and did not waken again until the sun was high in the heavens. They rose up and stood for some time listening to the birds singing, because Grannonia was delighted with their songs. When the fox perceived this, he said, "If you only understood as I do what the little birds are saying, your pleasure would be even greater." Provoked by his words, for we all know the curiosity which is deeply inborn in every woman, as even the love of talking, Grannonia implored the fox to tell her what the birds had said. At first, the wily fox refused to tell her what he had gathered from the conversation of the birds, but at last he gave way to her entreaties and told her that they had spoken of the misfortunes of a beautiful young prince, whom a wicked enchantress had turned into a snake for a period of 7 years. At the end of this time he had fallen in love with a charming princess, but that when he had shut himself into a room with her and then thrown off his snakeskin, her parents had forced their way into the room and had burnt the skin, whereupon the prince, changed into the likeness of a dove, had broken a pane of glass, and in trying to fly out of the window, he had wounded himself so badly that the doctors despaired for his life. Grannonia, when she had learnt they were talking of her lover, asked at once whose son he was, and if there was any hope of his recovery, to which the fox made answer that the birds had said he was the son of the king of Valongrosso, and that the only thing that could cure him was to rub the wounds on his head with the blood of the very birds who told his tale. Then Grannonia knelt down beside the fox and begged him, in her sweetest way, to catch the birds for her and procure their blood, promising at the same time to reward him richly. "All right," said the fox, "only don't be in such a hurry. Let's wait until night when the little birds have gone to roost, and then I'll climb up and catch them all for you." So they passed the day talking now of the beauty of the prince, and now the father of the princess, and then the misfortune that had happened. At last the night arrived, and all the little birds were asleep high up in the branches of the big tree. The fox climbed stealthily and caught the little birds with his paws, one after the other, And when he had killed them all, he put their blood into a little bottle which he wore at his side, and returned with it to Granonia, who was beside herself with joy at the assault of the fox's raid. But the fox said, "My dear daughter, your joy is in vain, because, let me tell you, this blood is of no earthly use for you unless you add some of mine to it." And with these words, he took to his heels. Granonia, who saw her hopes dashed to the ground in this cruel way, had recourse to flattery and cunning, weapons which have often stood the sex of good steed, and called out after the fox, "Father Fox, you would be quite right to save your skin if, in the first place, I didn't feel I owed you so much, and if, in the second, there weren't other foxes in the world. But as you know how grateful I feel to you, and there are heaps of other foxes about, you can trust yourself to me. Don't behave like a cow and kick the pails after it has filled it with milk, but continue your journey with me, and when we get to the capital, you can sell me to the king as a servant girl." Now, it never entered the fox's head that even foxes can be outwitted. So after a bit he consented to go with her. But he hadn't gone far before the cunning girl seized the stick and gave him such a blow with it on the head that he dropped down dead on the spot. Then Granonia took some of his blood and poured it into the little bottle, and went on her way as fast as she could to Valone Grosso. When she arrived there, she went straight to the royal palace and let the king be told that she had come to cure the young prince. The king commanded her to be brought before him at once, and was much astonished when he saw that it was a girl who undertook to do what all the cleverest doctors of his kingdom had failed in. It was an attempt no hurts no one. He willingly consented that she should do what she could. "All I ask," said Granonia, "is that, should I succeed in what you desire, you will give me your son in marriage." The king, who had given up all hopes in his son's recovery, replied, "Only restore him to life and health, and he shall be yours. It is only fair to give a husband to who gives me a son." And so they went into the prince's room. The moment Granonia had rubbed the blood on his wounds, the illness left him, and he was as sound and well as ever. When the king saw his son thus marvelously restored to life and health, he turned to him and said, "My dear son, I thought of you as dead, and now, to my great joy and amazement, you are alive again. I promised this young woman that if she could cure you, to bestow your hand and heart to her. And seeing that heaven has been so gracious, you must fulfill the promise I made to her. For gratitude alone forces me to pay this debt." But the prince answered, "My lord and father, I would that my will were as free as my love for you is great. But as I have plighted my word to another maiden, you will see for yourself, and so will this young maiden, that I cannot go back from my word, and be faithless to her whom I love." When Granonia heard these words, and saw how deeply rooted the prince's love was for her, she felt very happy, and blushing rosy red, she said, "But should I get the other lady to give up her rights, would you then consent to marry me?" "Far be it from me," replied the prince, "to banish the beautiful picture of my love from my heart. Whatever she may say, my heart and desire will remain the same, and though I were to lose my life for it, I couldn't consent to this exchange." Granonia could keep silence no longer, and throwing off her peasant's disguise, she discovered herself to the prince, who was nearly beside himself with joy when he recognized his fair lady love. When then he told his father who she was and what she had done and suffered for his sake. Then they invited the king and queen of Starzalonga to the court, and they had a great wedding feast, and proved once more that there's no better seasoning for the joys of true love than a few pangs of grief.